Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our West Midlands Virtual Branch Masterclass. I'm just going to allow a few seconds to allow people time to join, and then we'll make a start with the introductions. I'm sure it's got to that time of day now where everyone's winding down a little bit. Hope you've had a good day so far. Perfect. Okay, so we'll make a start. Just before we do make a start with the introductions, I'm just going to run you through our house rules that we have for all of our webinars here at CIISec. Just to let you know, you will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but please do ask us plenty of questions using the Q&A box, and we'll be able to pick those up for you at the end. If you have any issues this evening, hopefully you don't, but if you do, then please let us know using the email address there on screen, which is support@ciisec.org, and another member of our team will be able to help you with any issues that you may have. Moving on, I won't waste any more time. I'm going to hand over to our host, and our host today is Richard Cornell, who's actually the West Midlands branch chair of CIISec, who's recently taken over our West Midlands branch and is relaunching it. So please keep your eyes peeled. I'm sure you'll see plenty more events coming from the West Midlands branch, starting off with this one. Richard has 25 years of experience working in the sector and is a cyber apprenticeship on-point assessor, and as I said, also the West Midlands branch chair of CIISec. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now to further introduce you to the session this afternoon and to introduce you to our speaker. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to the first West Midlands branch meeting for a little while. And it also gives me pleasure to be able to say welcome on a very warm and sunny afternoon from the West Midlands. I don't get to say that very often. So thank you, Sophie. If you would like to move on, we'll talk a little bit about CIISec before we start the talk from Mike. So CIISec is a membership organisation. We've got over 15,000 members, and as you can see, we've got a number of different membership levels, going right from student level up to corporate membership, and also running the National Cyber Security Centre Cyber Professional Scheme. So there's something for everybody. So if you're not a member, that might be something you might want to have a look at afterwards. We have a number of benefits from being a member. Attendance at various seminars like the one today, and also the live event that we do every year. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So we've got active regional branches all over the country, and as I say, this is the West Midlands branch that we're representing today for the first time in a couple of years. One of the other benefits of membership is the Pulse magazine that comes out quarterly. The next one will be out very soon and is on the theme of cyber-based criminal activity and law enforcement. So that's very timely, and look out for that one. So what is CIISec Live? So CIISec Live is one of the events that we run along with a whole program of things. So if we have a look at the next slide, we can see that there are a number of events coming up just in the next month. We've got a lot of things going on. I'll let you kind of digest that for a second, and then we'll move on and just talk very briefly about CIISec Live. So normally CIISec Live is an in-person event run over 2 days. Obviously last year we didn't run one for obvious reasons. This year it was going to be in person in Scotland, but it's recently been revised. Based on the current guidelines, we're going to run a virtual event this year, and that's in September. As you can see, we've got some very distinguished speakers. One of my personal favourites, Bruce Schneier, will be talking along with some others, so that's definitely one to look out for. As you could see, that there are various professional development opportunities here, and it's based on 3 different tracks, so you'll get to choose which of the events throughout the 2 days you want to partake in. It's very much a discussion-based event, not so much just kind of talk and chalk, but very much involvement from the audience as well. So that should be interesting. Okay, so I think we will now move on and kind of look at today's main focus, which, as I say, is all about cyber violence and the role of law enforcement. So this is a very topical and interesting topic. So let's move on and introduce our speaker for today. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome Mike Gillespie. So I've known Mike for a few years now, who has an organisation called Advent IM, which is based in the West Midlands. So Mike is the director and co-founder of Advent IM, also vice president of the 3CI Centre and the Strategic Cyberspace and Security Science Centre. So I managed to say that without tripping myself up. So lots of interesting things that Mike gets involved in, including, as you can see there, their advisor to the government on their CCTV advice and guidance. So that's interesting areas that Mike's involved in. But today the focus is on cyber violence. So without further ado, as they say, I shall hand over to Mike. As Sophie said at the beginning, if you've got any questions, please put them into the question and answer box that you see at the bottom in the middle of the screen, and I'll pick those up and put them to Mike at the end of the session. Okay, over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Richard, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. This seems a long time, actually, since I've been involved in a CIISec event, as it has been for many other people, particularly regional events. So it's great to be able to get these up and running using the technology at our disposal. So I was asked to talk today around the topic of cyber violence and the role of law enforcement and the role of prevention in cyber violence. So there's a few areas that I want to look at as part of this talk. So I think the first thing is to actually look at a definition of what cyber violence actually is. To look at the amount of currently reported online crime, violence, fraud, etc., and then consider that against the amount that is currently estimated that goes unreported. And to consider, when we're talking about cyber, as we all know, this is a multinational global issue, not just a national issue. And so there are considerable discrepancies and challenges around jurisdictional variance and who has the precedent to track, apprehend, and prosecute individuals or groups operating in cyberspace. But it might be useful to look at the role that tech giants play or possibly don't play in addressing cyber violence, stalking, the whole gambit of online harassment, people being pursued by individuals and groups because of their views, because they don't correspond with their own views, and so on. You're probably familiar with the term trolling and all of that. And then that obviously leading into what is the actual role of law enforcement, and is law enforcement in the 21st century good enough, competent enough, agile enough, capable enough to manage the current levels of online violence? And then finally, of course, it wouldn't be a cyber presentation without spending a little bit of time looking at the darknet and anonymity and the internet as it currently stands, and all of the challenges that the way in which the infrastructure has been built 30 years ago, since the World Wide Web first got commissioned, is it currently up to the job of protecting us? So first of all, then, let's have a look at a definition for cyber violence and break this down a little bit. So according to the Council of Europe's proposed definition, because there is no globally accepted or even EU-wide accepted definition of cyber violence, this is a proposed definition. The use of systems to cause, facilitate, or threaten violence against individuals. So to cause violence, to facilitate violence, or to threaten violence. So you can see straight away the broadness of that definition. That results in, or is likely to result in, physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm, or suffering, and may include the exploitation of the individual circumstances, characteristics, or vulnerabilities. Now you compare that to the standard definitions of various types of violence that we have here in the UK. And if you think that for physical violence, you've got everything from common assault through to actual bodily harm, up to grievous bodily harm, up to wounding, and so on. So we're trying to define all online violence in one definition, when in the physical world, we have probably upwards of half a dozen different definitions, depending on the severity. So this definition takes into no account the severity of the harm. There's a need to prove the intent to cause, facilitate, or threaten. Then you've got to prove that that has resulted or is likely to result in harm, physical, sexual, psychological, or economic. And if not harm, then how do you demonstrate that it has caused suffering? And suffering, of course, is in itself a very subjective thing. And the exploitation of the individual's circumstances. So a really broad definition trying to look at cyber violence, because of course, as soon as something goes online, it's not real crime. So we need separate definitions for it because cyber is special, right? But should it be? Is a cybercrime more or less or the same severity as a physical crime? Is cyber violence more or less important than physical violence? I'll just leave that hanging there, and it'd be interesting to see what you think when we get to looking at the comments and questions at the end of this session. Now, what we do know is that the ONS estimates that there is a massive underreporting of all cybercrime. So only about 16% of cybercrime actually gets reported, and there's currently no breakout for cyber violence. In fact, the vast majority of the focus when it comes to cybercrime is around cyber fraud and other financially focused cybercrime. I wonder how many of our police forces, if we even try to report cyber violence to them, would have a mechanism to take that report, to allocate it, to quantify it, and how many of us would even get a response back from a police officer who understood cybercrime and was able to investigate it appropriately. So the chances are that reporting for cyber violence is probably still highly unlikely. The occasional high-profile case where individuals report cyber stalking, perhaps, but in the main, going back to that definition, I'm prepared to put money on the fact that the vast majority of cyber violence, use of systems to cause, facilitate, or threaten violence against individuals, goes unreported. So ask the question, is an online crime more or less or the same as important as a physical crime? Is hate speech online the same as hate speech in reality? Stalking, the use of revenge porn, rape threats. I don't know if anybody's seen the figures that have come out in the last couple of weeks about the number of underage school children that have been sexually propositioned online since the lockdown. People being threatened with rape, people being threatened with murder, suicide baiting. There are whole sites, whole elements of our social media that are dedicated to people who are either considering suicide or in those same sites who are absolutely hell-bent on convincing people to go through with it. Doxing, the outing of personal information, location information, and all sorts of things, and publishing it online, and so on, and so on. In fact, pretty much everything you can consider as a possible crime here in the physical world is capable online as well. But are the same protections afforded across the board to all victims? And is that regardless of geography? Because where does the crime occur? When you're attacked in the street is the location of the crime, the location of the victim, the location of the attacker. But what happens when you get attacked online? What happens when what happens to you online isn't considered to be a crime in the jurisdiction in which the criminal, the perpetrator, is sat? Is it time that we considered the need for a cyber Interpol? Do we need a single international internet police force to track these individuals and bring them to justice and protect the vulnerable from these perpetrators? And how would that work? And whose jurisdiction will they be brought to for trial? All of these are questions that need to be answered. All of these are questions actually that we've been talking about for some years, that we need governments to get together and address as a matter of priority. Because at the moment, the legislation is nowhere near as good as the ability of the criminal class. What about the big tech companies? What's their role in all of this? When we look at the world's leading tech giants, excuse me, the world leading tech giants, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook. Remember, of course, that Facebook also own Instagram. Look at the market share that those tech companies own. Now think about the algorithms that those tech companies are able to bring to bear in order to market their products at you, in order to sell your personal information to other companies so their products can be marketed at you. All of your online activity is constantly monitored. Of course it is. Google at the moment want to do away with individual cookies and introduce one great big cookie that they have control of. Well, of course they do. But then Google is the sort of company that when you tick the box, don't use tracking cookies, believes that doesn't belong to them, has no relevance to them. Oh, those tracking cookies, they said. We didn't think you meant those Google tracking cookies. Why wouldn't you want Google to track you? Think about how often you search for something online and within seconds, Open up your social media feed and get an advert for exactly the sort of thing you've just been looking at. And yet these same tech companies would have us believe that it's too difficult for them to identify and take down inappropriate content. It's too difficult, it would appear, for these tech giants to be able to identify online stalking. Not just identify it, but stop it. Too difficult, apparently, for Instagram to identify that there are groups which are talking about suicide and in which there are people doing suicide baiting. Too difficult, it would appear, for OnlyFans to be able to identify underage, that's paedophilic pornographic material being posted by underage individuals on their site. Too difficult, it would appear, for Facebook to be able to identify hate speech and stop it from happening. So these are the lords of the internet, and they can't or won't play their part in keeping you and I, our families, and our children safe from harm, protecting us from stalkers, harassment, hate speech, racism, protecting us from threats. So the next time you log into your Gmail account, your Facebook account, your Instagram account, dare I even say it, the next time you're on LinkedIn, just remember all the information that they're capable of collecting about every individual, you and I, and yet they don't seem to be able to spot a dangerous individual and stop them in their tracks. So what about law enforcement then? Well, if big tech cannot, will not, is not willing to, is not able to, you decide the right language here. If big tech is not fixing cyber violence, how do we expect that UK police forces can? If technology companies with a global footprint and a global reach and billions of users are not able to address this problem, how are under-resourced, under-trained, and under-prepared police forces with small, relative to other major crimes, small cybercrime units supposed to address the issue of cyber violence? There's no international cyber task force, and there's no commonality of legislation. So even if the UK police detect and are able to identify where a cybercrime or cyber violence has happened, the biggest challenge they face is that often those individuals will not be sat in the UK and they have no jurisdiction over them. And if there's no commonality of legislation, look how modern our own stalking legislation has become. Recently introduced stalking legislation to protect individuals, where we've learned the lesson that if stalking is left unchecked, it goes from being distant stalking to close physical harm. But that legislation is not common across Europe, let alone across the world. And I find myself wondering, is there really a common will to globally tackle this problem? Are governments themselves generally bought into the need to tackle this problem? Some years ago, the UK government identified cyber terrorism and cyber crime as a tier 1 threat. And yet, recent reports have said that the government continues to be incapable, underskilled, and without sufficient expertise to be able to address that tier 1 threat. And if we're not able to address it in the UK, then how many other nation states are unable to address it locally? So I'll take you back to my question. Is it time for a cyber Interpol? Do we need a single police force policing the internet? And what about the dark net? Some people call it the deep net. How dangerous is the dark net? We know that all technology is used by both good and bad people. Terrorists are just as likely to use a pay-and-go mobile phone as a single mother. Equally, academics are just as likely to use the deep net, the dark net, as terrorists, criminals, stalkers, drug dealers, and gun runners. In fact, it is the same network that allows people in oppressed societies to be able to get their message out, to publish blogs, to communicate with the outside world. And I wonder if 30 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee had been able to see the world that we live in today, maybe he wouldn't have built the internet the way he did. Maybe the World Wide Web would have looked something different. Maybe, dare I say it, the World Wide Web maybe would have looked a little bit more like the deep net. Because certainly with the deep net comes the potential for anonymity. The protection from having your personal information harvested at every turn and exploited for marketing purposes. So maybe this is the internet we deserve. Now, I know that there are huge challenges to law enforcement about the way that this technology has been designed. It's deliberately designed to be anonymous. It's peer-to-peer. It's random. It's complicated routing. It's everything that a secure network needs to be secure. But those same challenges to law enforcement are the same benefits that individuals are able to gain when it comes to privacy and protection. So maybe the next 30 years will bring about a step change in the way that the internet is used, designed, and protected to stop that exploitation from becoming any more severe. But more importantly, to protect those vulnerable individuals from cyber violence. The threat of physical, emotional harm to individuals who are vulnerable. Certainly, the deep net allows us to stop tech companies, or currently to stop tech companies exploiting individuals, whilst at the same time fails to enable law enforcement. And this is the argument we get from many governments, that we mustn't have too much security as individuals because that allows the criminals to be able to get away with it. That's why governments would like to have back doors into encryption, the ability to sneak inside our WhatsApp or Signal or whatever secure messaging signal system you switch to. But do we give up the privacy rights of millions so that government can track the behavior of a few. Has this gone so far that it's no longer a government or policing issue, but actually that we need the people who run the backbone of the internet to be able to police this for us? So go back to that original definition, cyber violence. Does cyber violence as a definition in itself need to be more granular? Then do we need to engage as a global community, global governments, to put in a single legislative process to allow that definition to be recognized, criminalized, pursued, and prosecuted? Because at the moment, it's a little bit like the Wild West out there. And Billy the Kid is winning. So what I would like to do is I'd like to finish the presentation there, but I'd like us to be able to switch to the online discussion, to the questions and answers. And not just for it to be questions and answers, but I'd really like to hear your opinions. And I'd like this to be a bit of a dialogue now. Where is the future policing of the internet going to come from?
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. That is extremely thought-provoking and a very serious subject indeed. I think we're all a bit overawed by that now. I guess the kind of point that you ended up on is one that's been raised in one of the questions that we've had. So question from Harry was, so if we as a society feel unable to police and control illegal activities online, would we prefer, or would you prefer, a Chinese model of cyber censorship, where the state decides what goes and what doesn't, or what's legal and what's desirable?
That's a brilliant question, Harry. I think that we have to look at three things here. The first is we need to understand as a society what we consider to be ethical. And ethical and legal are not always the same thing. And we need to build ethical legislation that protects citizens. And if you look, here in the UK, the way our legislation is structured, it's designed to set out, in most cases, fairly clearly, until you get to the tech world, what is considered to be beyond the boundaries of what is lawful. And often lawful and ethical are closely entwined. When we get to tech crime, it's almost as though there is a nod in the direction of tech crime as being somehow more legitimate. You only get 4 to 6 years if you take £60 million out of the banking system with a computer, but you get 15 if you walk into a bank with a shotgun and rob it. Why aren't they both bank robbery? Why do we need a separate cyber legislation that separates out cyber violence from violence, cyber stalking from stalking, cyber domestic abuse from domestic abuse? Maybe our legislative framework simply needs to recognize that this is just a new way of doing crime, not just a special way of doing crime. And those crimes are just crimes. But no, I would not recommend a Chinese model which censors citizens. And I think there's a difference there. The Chinese model would allow the censorship of citizens as to what they can see and what they can say. And I think that's very different to using the tech companies to identify criminal and inappropriate behavior online and be able to bring it down. So no, I wouldn't recommend a Chinese firewall, but I'd like to have some of the capability that the Chinese have within our police forces to enable our police forces to be able to get hold of some of these perpetrators and bring them to justice properly.
So kind of related to that is the question of whether or not users should be allowed to be anonymous online. So if there isn't state censorship, then should at least law enforcement or whoever needs to know be able to identify who is doing and saying what?
Yeah, I think so. And there's an element of that, you know, let's be honest, nobody is truly anonymous online, even using browsers like Tor and various other tools. There are always ways in which our behavior can be tracked online. It's the lack of resources available to identify the inappropriate behavior. You look at how the last Investigative Powers Act gave powers to the service providers and email storage providers to be able to hold all of our data so that on the off chance they could retrospectively go back and try to find the needle in the haystack. What we actually need is something built into the agreement to operate with the tech companies that they're doing that proactively. We should be able to identify inappropriate behavior, hate speech, suicide baiting, rape threats, threats of violence, and a whole range of other cybercrime on top of what we've looked at in terms of cyber violence, and be able to nip that in the bud proactively instead of trying to find that needle in a haystack months down the line. The tech companies can do that to you when you're trying to buy something, but they're not prepared to do that for you when you're being threatened by someone. And to me, that is fundamentally wrong.
So another question would be, so how can we get big tech to be accountable for abuse on their platforms? How can we get them to invest as much in protecting us as they do on tracking us?
I think it needs to be fundamentally built into their license to operate. I think they need to be properly regulated the way that here in the UK, companies like telecoms operators are properly regulated. We need to drive Ocean horses through the smokescreen that Facebook is not a publisher. We need to stop companies from using excuses as to why they can't do it. And they spend as much money using lawyers to wriggle out of protecting us as it would cost them to actually protect us in the first place. Because we're the product. We're not customers, we're the product. There's no benefit to protecting us if they don't get the data to market to us. Facebook isn't free. You're paying for it with your own liberty, with your own privacy, with your own data.
So there's a comment from Peter in the Q&A. He's quoting Benjamin Franklin, who said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." I think that's very apropos.
It's very, very appropriate. And I think, you know, in many, many ways, what we have given up is almost the entire right to our own privacy and safety for the convenience of free social media.
So, so a question from Claire. In your mind, are there any current international frameworks that could be used in this situation? For example, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And from this, how effective do you think the Tallinn Manual 2.0 to be?
I think that's absolutely brilliant question, Claire. And actually, we have already previously been talking about and writing about the need for there to be an international convention on cyber warfare and the use of cyber weaponry. You know, we talk a lot in the realms of sort of biochemical and nuclear warfare of those being weapons of mass destruction. When you look at the capability that certain online tools have now, look at the destruction that ransomware can wreak. If you look at just a couple of years ago with WannaCry, look at the destruction that WannaCry, which basically was a stockpiled NSA weapon, allegedly. Look at how that ripped around the world and the destruction that wrought on computer systems. Look at the organizations, both public sector and private sector, who are still struggling to recover as a result of what is effectively a cyber weapon being unleashed on them. So yes, I do think there's a lot of commonality between the work that was done on international conventions for human rights, international conventions for the use and the restrictions on the use of chemical and biological weaponry. And really, all a piece of ransomware or a cyber virus is just a cyber biological warfare. So we should have international conventions on them, especially when you consider that we know that there are governments who are currently actively developing hostile attack capability, the hostile online equivalent of nuclear weapons for state-to-state warfare. I think we need to have an international convention that governs the safety and security of the internet before things go too far. The sad thing is, when you look at even just the International Convention on the use of biological weapons and chemical weapons, look at that took decades for governments to sign up to, and rogue nations still ignore it.
Indeed, they do.
It's a bit like having everybody in the playground sign up to a non-bullying convention apart from the bullies.
So there's a few questions related to big tech and whether they can police themselves. So I'll kind of roll a few questions up into one, if I may, because they're related. So somebody says, it gives the example of Twitter deciding unanimously to silence Donald Trump during the or following the recent presidential election, and whether that kind of activity should, these tech companies should be allowed to police themselves because of those kinds of things that happen. And there's a suggestion that maybe we should embed the police within big tech so that they'll be able to investigate within. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, fantastic. Loads of good stuff there. Can big tech be trusted to police themselves? Can journalism, as a parallel question, can journalism, because that's what they keep saying every time that we have, look at the output of the Leveson inquiry, but apparently they can still be trusted to police themselves and comply with a code of ethics voluntarily. Now, it's interesting what's happened in the last couple of years. Look at the the approach that Facebook has been taken to Australia. Look at how social media platforms cut off Donald Trump, but apparently they're not editors. They're not responsible for the content of their platform, and yet they can sanction whether people can be on their platform. They can cut people off, give people lifetime bans, and in some cases, block whole countries from seeing certain content. But they're not editors. They're just a platform. It's an oxymoron. Can tech companies be trusted to police themselves? No, they can't. Full stop. You know, Facebook's response to the whole Cambridge Analytica debacle just shows that they can't be trusted to police themselves. Should the police be embedded within tech companies? Well, the police are public servants. Tech companies are private companies. So how do you embed a public servant into a private company and ensure that they've got the access that they need and ensure that they've got the transparency that they need? Or do they just become, let's say, let's just be generous and let's say, is there a risk that they go native?
So Claire suggests that we should look at the US model of private-public partnership, and maybe that would be an effective route for holding tech companies accountable.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Claire. I think that for it to be truly successful, it has to be a partnership, and it has to be a public-private partnership where there is full accountability and transparency. But to do that, we need to have the ability to make those tech companies be transparent. And at the moment, the tech companies, which they face it, are largely based out of the US, are pretty much thumbing their noses to the rest of the international community of saying, we're going to hide behind the fact that we're not responsible for the content on our platform. If you tell us it's there, we might potentially spend some effort taking it down, but actually we already know it's there. So even if you tell us it's there, why would you take it down if it's generating footfall? Because footfall equals revenue.
So Mike, Harry suggests that maybe we should give up some of our hard-won liberties, such as the right to free speech, the right to associate, etc., in order to make society feel safe online.
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think quite the opposite, actually. I think if we can make society feel safe online, then we actually reclaim back the liberties, such as the right to free speech and the right to associate. And I don't think we need to give up our liberty to live in a safe community or to live in a safe society. And in fact, if you equate it to the physical world, actually where you have unsafe communities where people feel unable to leave their homes safely, that is when you give up your liberty because you are confined to your own individual space. When the streets are safe, the parks are safe, the communities are safe, people can go about their business safely, then you gain liberty, not give up liberty. But these tech companies, let's not forget, we put an awful lot of effort into criticizing the government and the police for online monitoring. You know, GCHQ comes under a huge amount of criticism from time to time about the amount of online monitoring they do. And it's a fraction of the amount of online monitoring that big tech does without doing any good whatsoever. I'm going to get my Twitter account suspended by the end of this.
You never know who's listening, do you?
Never know.
So Michael suggests, would you advocate for the expansion of the role of the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute serious cybercrimes as
Yeah.
the Colonial Pipeline or Irish Health Service hacks, amongst others?
Yes, absolutely, I would. Yes, it has to be an international coordinated effort for this to work. We know that as well, that many of these gangs are they're organized, they're coordinated, and they're operating out of certain jurisdictions with impunity. The international community has to address that.
And inevitably a follow-up question from somebody else is, so who watches the watchers? I won't attempt to read out the Latin version, which they've typed. So if we have an organization that starts policing the internet and the contents, then who's going to watch them and make sure that they don't go native?
Then you, presumably, as we have in the UK, you've got to have an independent office of police conduct. So there would need to be some sort of oversight of that. Who polices Interpol? Who has oversight of Interpol? Who has oversight of Europol? I don't think it's any different, to be perfectly honest. We're talking about having a police force that has the skills, the knowledge, the capability to be able to police online behaviors and activities, to track down dangerous criminals and to bring them to justice. And I think that's very different when you have got a proper coordinated police activity, either as we have within an individual police force in the UK or Europol or Interpol, as opposed to placing police officers inside tech organizations where they have the potential to be manipulated and go native. And that's what I was referring to in terms of the go native comment.
So on the point about embedding police in private companies, the example that's been given is in the Financial Action Task Force, where banks and financial institutions and law enforcement sit around the table to ensure that financial crime is combated. So that might be an interesting model to look at.
It's a possible model to look at. Again, I think you only have to look at the last 10 years, LIBOR and interest rate fixing, money laundering, in unethical practices in the banking sector. So, if you're going to have a regulator or you're going to have a police force that is there to take these companies to task, then they actually have to have the power, the teeth, to be able to act on that.
So one of the things that I know is being looked at the moment is the Computer Misuse Act.
Yeah, the Computer Misuse Act 1990.
So is there an opportunity to get cyber violence considered a crime under the Computer Misuse Act, perhaps?
I certainly think that all of that has to be built into the next iteration of the Computer Misuse Act. But any online legislation, any tech legislation, has to also be written in such a way that it is tech agnostic to allow crime to be crime. We don't write, for example, gun legislation does not say it's a crime to shoot somebody with a blunderbuss and then it's not able to be applied because you've used a semi-automatic rifle. So the legislation has to be appropriate and has to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It has to stand the test of time. So if it's too aligned to individual tech or individual weaponry, then it's going to go out of date very quickly.
So just for
Michael, you were talking in code originally.
You saw that. Unfortunately, Michael's translated his question.
Yeah, I agree with that, Michael. The ICC is judge-based and it's led with judges nominated from many countries, absolutely. In the same way as things like, you know, The Hague and various other international courts have that capability and their far-reaching capability that they have.
So I think we're almost out of time. There's one comment that Petros made earlier on, which I wanted to come back to. It's a nice way to kind of end up. The question of what's ethical and what's unethical, and the suggestion that we still have a task to do to convince people that cyberbullying, for example, is real.
Yes.
So if we're struggling to convince people that cyberbullying is real, how are we going to convince people that cyber violence is real?
Absolutely. We have to start by taking this seriously. You know, when I went to school back in the early 80s, most schools would tell you there was no such thing as bullying in school. As a child, I can tell you bullying was very real, especially for a child like me, who was a little bit geeky and fairly mild and introverted. So the first thing is to recognize that this sort of crime exists. Then you've got to take it seriously. Then you've got to allow an avenue for it to be reported. And then you've got to take that report seriously. And that goes, you know, that goes across all crime. You know, we continue to see figures lamenting how few domestic abuse cases. There's a big story actually this morning about how few domestic abuse cases reported by partners of police officers actually get investigated and end up with a prosecution. I think it was less than 6%. So, you know, we've got to get better at recognizing a crime exists, allowing good quality reporting and collection of that reporting, then having a call to action, and then being able to take action against that crime. And cyber violence is very real, and in many cases over the years has led to young, vulnerable people taking their lives. And that, as a society, is immoral, unethical, and ought to be illegal.
Absolutely, and some thank you comments in the Q&A reinforcing what you just said. So very much appreciated. So thank you very much, Mike. It's been a fascinating conversation. If anybody's still got any outstanding questions or any other points they'd like to make or want to follow up with anything that Mike said, then you can get in touch with Mike through the usual social media channels. Or if you've got any questions about CIISec or any of our upcoming events, you can see the CIISec email address on the screen at the moment. So
thanks very much. I'm so glad that I took the risk of opening up for the floor for questions and debate, because clearly there's been a lot of stuff we've been able to talk about here, which, you know, if you just had your usual 5 or 10 minutes right at the very end, we wouldn't have got through a fraction of that. And thank you to you, the audience, for being so proactive and coming forward with such great questions. It's really made it fun for me as well. Thank you.
okay, well, I think we're out of time and we're out of questions. So as I say, you can catch up with CIISec or Mike or myself on social media or on the email address below. So this has been recorded, so if you want to pass it on to anybody else, you'll find it on the CIISec website in the not too distant future. So again, thank you very much, Mike, for taking your time this evening to join us.
Thank you so much, Richard, as well for hosting the event. It's been fantastic. And just to let the audience know as well, there will be a masterclass later on in the year on anonymity and hate speech. So we obviously touched upon that quite a lot on this webinar. So if you like the sound of that, it's not on the website yet, but it will be soon. So please keep your eyes peeled for that. But thank you so much, everyone, and we hope to see you on the next one.